So good morning, I'm Julie.
I'm Birook Mekonnen.
We're happy to have the opportunity to share our work on community cultural wealth. And before we get started, I want to mention that we use the term Black to refer to individuals who come from the African diaspora and may identify as African American. So when we look at the experiences of excellent Black scientists, we often find that as students, they encountered many challenges. Because those challenges still exist for Black students, there are issues with Black scientists being underrepresented in science fields. And our research team is really interested in addressing underrepresentation, and we feel that the way to do this is to consider promoting persistence of Black students in science majors. But most of the research in the field focuses on barriers. And while the barriers are important, our group acknowledges that it's not enough to know what the challenges are, but you also have to know how folks overcome those challenges. And so we're also interested in understanding Black students' mechanisms of success. So in order to do that, we have to take a different approach than the one that is traditionally taken in the literature, and we use an anti-deficit achievement approach. So this approach was first outlined by Dr. Sean Harper in his National Black College Achievement Study. And essentially what Dr. Harper encourages us to do is look at the success of students of color, not the failure of students of color in our research. So Dr. Harper invites us to reverse deficit-oriented questions, like why do so many Black students leave science majors, and reframe them in an achievement-oriented way, where we could ask, why do Black students persist in science majors despite all known barriers? So with this anti-deficit achievement approach in mind, we selected a framework to guide our studies, and this is known as community cultural wealth. So community cultural wealth was outlined by Dr. Tara Yasso, and it comes out of critical race theory. And here Dr. Yasso emphasizes the unique strengths that students of color bring to their education, which may be very different than the strengths that are brought by students from predominant culture. So community cultural wealth, here we're not talking about money, but rather capital that students possess in the form of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts that they can use for academic success. And there are 6 forms of capital in Dr. Yasso's framework. They're listed here on the right side, and Birook and I will define and give examples of them throughout today's talk. Just as one example, aspirational capital is the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers. So I need to note that these forms of capital are not discrete categories. We may find within the student stories that forms of capital may overlap or intersect. And I think it's important to underscore as we go through that community cultural wealth can contribute to Black students' success, but it often goes unrecognized. Because we're going to think about this wealth that goes unrecognized, I want us to do a little activity together. So I'm going to invite you to do a think, pair, share, and most of us in the room are educators and have some experience with this. What I want you to do is think about a time when your strengths went unrecognized. And I want you to think about how did it feel when your abilities were overlooked. And before I invite you to consider this on your own and discuss how you felt with a neighbor, I realize you didn't drive here this morning thinking you were going to reflect on when you were overlooked, right? So I'll get us started with an example. In my first faculty position, I was put in charge of a large undergraduate research program. And some of my senior colleagues didn't see my organization and planning skills. So I received a number of emails from them following up on me to see if I had taken care of important tasks, which most of the time I had taken care of a month before the email even came through. And I felt frustrated, disappointed that they would ask me to take care of a project that they didn't trust me to have the skills to carry out. So just as one example, and now I want to invite you to consider this on your own for just 1 minute. Might be a little quiet in the room, and then it will get much louder as we share with a neighbor, and then I'll ask for 1 or 2 brave volunteers to share how they felt in those types of experiences. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking a moment to think about this question. I would love it if someone would share maybe just how they felt, You might not have to describe that experience, but just how you felt when your strengths were unrecognized. Thank you.
Yeah, well, just you felt less of a person. You know, you feel like, why are you here? You know, why are, in my particular case is, contributing to a meeting, and my contributions were totally ignored, and it turned out I was right. And it hurt someone's career, actually. And so, future, when we have these same incidents come up in future meetings, I'm like, well, why am I going to contribute? I mean, if you're not going to take what I have and use it, then why should I continue to contribute?
Right. So this experience of being unrecognized for our strengths can make us feel like, what are we even doing here if you're going to overlook them? And on top of that, in your case, and same for the students, you were right. And to be discounted when you actually have important information, things to share, it's definitely one of those feelings that leaves you walking away saying, well, why should I come back to the table? And so those are, I really appreciate that, because those are some of the things our participants talked about as well. And so I just want to invite everyone to kind of think about those things that you talked about or what you just heard as we go through today's presentation.
So Julie and I investigated the community cultural wealth of Black science majors. We did this in collaboration with Dr. Darius Means, Wumni Oni, Lolo Babatula, and Chimizio Sandu. So we had two major goals of our study. First research goal was to identify and characterize the community cultural wealth these Black science majors bring to college. And our action goal was to use this knowledge gained to raise awareness of the unique strengths Black students bring to science. So our explicit research questions for our studies were, what forms of capital do these academically successful Black science students use to persist in their respective majors? And what are their mechanisms of success? So we utilized an approach called participatory action research, PAR, and it involves a partnership between researchers and people from marginalized groups. So, for example, in our research, we had 2 faculty members and 4 co-researchers who majored in science. And as co-researchers, we brought critical expertise to the project because we were all Black science majors. PAR teams also collaborate on research, and they promote with the goal of promoting social change through evidence-based products, as we will discuss later. So for our study participants, all 20 of our participants met our major criteria of persisting to their final year of their science major. Each participant must have met at least one of these listed criteria here, or more. So these criteria are they have had the last cumulative GPA of 3.0 or received an A grade in a science course. We chose to use a more broad definition of academic success, so we included 2 additional criteria, which are participation in undergraduate research or engagement in a science-related organization. So for data collection, we used 2 semi-structured interviews to investigate our participants' use of different forms of capital. Semi-structured interviews are set up where the interviewer has a protocol with a set question, but it allows flexibility to ask related follow-up questions. So we also utilized a card elicitation activity during the second interview to encourage participants to talk about their community cultural wealth. This figure below shows a timeline of the data collection. So we did the first interview in the fall semester and the second interview with the card elicitation activity in the spring semester. So card elicitation activity is that we did in the second interview is actually an approach that comes from anthropology, and it allows participants to explore topics more deeply. So in our research, we wanted to let them talk about their community cultural wealth. So in our research, we did participants consider 6 decks of cards that corresponded to each form of capital, and within all those ideas on these cards came from previous interview done in the fall. So participants had to select cards that resonated with them and then discuss those cards with the interviewer. It's also important to note that card elicitation activity is important because community cultural wealth is often unrecognized by the students themselves. This is a schematic that shows the data analysis that we did in our research. So we, for qualitative data analysis, we utilized a method called content analysis, so in which we labeled relevant segments of data using codes to eventually group related codes together and identify broader themes within the data.
So before I share some of our results, I want to point out that we did one study at a predominantly white institution that is high research activity in a doctoral university. So while some of the ideas I'm going to share may be generalizable, other ideas may be very specific to our participants in this particular context. So just to give you an overview of what Birook and I will share, I'm going to provide evidence that our participants use various forms of capital outlined in community cultural wealth, as well as some novel forms of capital. And then Birook will explain how multiple forms of capital were used by students and came together in cross-cutting themes in our data. So first I want to talk about the use of aspirational capital, which earlier I defined as the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers. And what we found is that our participants were very self-motivated to pursue careers in science, and their reasons were largely outside of themselves as people, which Birook will share about in a little while. We also found that they maintained confidence in their ability to be successful in science career paths, even when they experience minor setbacks. So for example, if they earned a grade that they were not happy with, they might have been disappointed, but they weren't discouraged about continuing in science. So this is a quote from Michelle, which is a pseudonym, and in fact, all names in today's presentation are pseudonyms. She said, "I'm a very driven person. I think it's more innate. I don't really have someone I look up to and say, I want to be just like them. It's more like, I want to do this. I know what I need to do to be that future me. I was built for this." And Michelle went on to talk about how she wanted to be a chemistry professor who would then go on to be a university administrator and one day a university president. And she was highly motivated for this path and thought about how she could help other people of color along the way. We also saw success through navigational capital, which are skills that are required for navigating through higher education and other social institutions, despite subtle and overt racism. And I think it's important for us to remember that most of the colleges and universities in the United States were not designed with students of color in mind. And our participants talked about a key to their success was tapping into resources on campus really early on in their studies so that they could navigate this system. They also were willing to self-advocate. So they were willing to ask for help as needed. And here's a quote from Alexandra that illustrates that. She said, "If I don't understand the material, I'll either ask my professor or somebody in the class, even if I don't know them well. Sometimes I can tell that they don't like me asking them questions, but honestly, I have to pass." And so Alexandra explained how the discomfort she might have felt knowing that maybe some of her inquiries were not welcome did not outweigh her need to know the information and have access to what she needed to be successful. We also saw success through resistant capital, which is defined as agencies, abilities gained from exercising agency to challenge inequality or oppressive messages. And here, many of our participants talked about a pressure they felt to maintain a positive image of Black people, which Birook will also comment on in a moment. And they also spoke about experiencing microaggressions as well as subtle and overt racism. And many of the students in our study talked about how it was important for them to educate some of the people that were saying these things and explaining to them why what they were saying was wrong. Susan said, "I want to represent the Black community well so that we can get further than where we are now. It shouldn't have to be that we have to prove ourselves in every situation, but that's just how it is." Another form of capital that was evidenced by our participants was familial capital. And familial capital refers to the ability to expand family boundaries to include extended family and friends and a community well-being commitment. So a lot of our participants were motivated to build or maintain excellence in science legacy for their family. We found that they drew tremendous strength from family members, not just parents and siblings, but also friends, church family that they were deeply connected to. Alexandra said, "I'm a fourth generation African American in college. I'm not going to be the first PhD in my family, but I have a legacy to follow and I'm still maintaining my own legacy. It's all motivational." So Alexandra's parents had set forth this legacy of achievement in science by earning PhDs in science, and she wanted to take it to the next level. We also saw success through linguistic capital, which refers to skills that are gained from experiencing more than one language or communication style. And here our participants talked about the need to code switch. And as you may know, code switch refers to changing the way you're speaking based on the situation. We also had several participants who were bilingual, and they said that they could leverage this ability by making immediate connections with other scientists who may speak the same foreign language as they did. Regarding code switching, Annie said, "I know how to kill interviews. I know how to be professional. I also know how to have fun and talk the way I want to. I know how to switch on and off when it's necessary." And Annie saw this as a strength, and we could imagine how this could be useful in other settings, especially as scientists where we're required to communicate to a variety of different audiences. We also found novel forms of capital. I'm just sharing one here with you, spiritual capital, where our participants derive confidence and strength from spirituality and religious beliefs. So here's a quote from Mark. He said, "My faith has just really helped me to be focused. When I fail, I get back up and just know I'm supported and that my life just does not revolve around my academics." So in his interview, Mark went on to say that he knows in science there's failure at the bench. But this failure doesn't deter him because he has a larger purpose in his life beyond just success in science. And he talked a lot about his relationship with God. So now that you've seen several forms of capital and some examples, I want to give you an opportunity to identify community cultural wealth using examples from our data. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to discuss with a neighbor what forms of capital you recognize in the example, again, that came from our data. And I never like my audience to be bored, so if you're speedy, there's a second example you can work on during this time. So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk about that with someone nearby. Thank you again for actively participating. Folks in the back told me that that's probably enough time. I'd love to hear from someone who would be willing to share what forms of capital they saw in the first example.
Oh, look.
Yes, please.
We were just talking about how we tend to be the person who initiates things. So we saw two, and so I caught one, and then she actually picked up on a second one. But we were saying, obviously navigational, reaching out to a person to get assistance. But then you had mentioned
The
another one.
familial one, because you want to make sure that you're doing well to represent like your community as well. So I think it's like a mix of both.
Yeah, so we definitely see navigational capital here, but we also may see familial capital coming into play because of those other ties to family that may make this success in science even more meaningful to that individual. Did anybody see another form of capital not mentioned?
I was thinking aspirational because they're persisting in pursuing their science and trying to find out what they should do, even though their advisors are going to consider another major.
Right, and so we talked about with aspirational capital, that idea of kind of real or perceived barriers, and here we have an advisor coming in, maybe recommending a different path, and continuing on that path by advocating and asking someone else can be a form of aspirational capital. And I know in conversations with others that some folks saw that this might also represent resistant capital as well. So part of the reason why we asked you to do this is just to give you a chance to see that this idea that the forms of capital may overlap, and in a student story you can see more than one strength coming into play.
So now that you guys have heard some evidence of different forms of capital, we'd like to share 3 cross-cutting themes that tell a more coherent story of our data. So the first theme I'd like to discuss is the theme of a deeper calling, which is defined as Black science majors felt deeply called to the careers in the science field beyond individualistic motivations. So within this idea, within this theme, we see a couple of ideas, such as creating or surpassing a family legacy, such as Julie discussed earlier, to give back to the communities of color, and also to help others see themselves in science. So I'd like to give you guys an example from a quote from one of our participants of the last idea here. So let's hear an example, a quote from Michelle.
I want to show young Black girls that you can be a chemist. You can do this. I don't have any Black chemists that I look up to. I don't have any Black chemistry professors, Black chemistry mentors. I don't have that. So I was like, I want to be that.
Thanks. So we see in this quote that Michelle aspires to be a chemist because she didn't have that when she was younger. And so she would like to be that chemist to show young Black girls that they can do it too. The second theme I'd like to discuss with you guys is the challenges to overcome. And this theme was defined as, although Black students felt deeply called to science, they experienced enormous amounts of stress. So a couple of ideas that we see here are stress of being in a rigorous science major. So this encompasses the academic stress, but also the stress of being a Black student, especially at a PWI. There was also the idea of pressure to represent Black people well. And I'll also like to give you guys an example of this last idea here with a quote from Robert, I believe.
I typically don't feel like I belong. And I always feel like in order to feel like I belong, I have to prove myself in almost every single class that I have. So when we did a science course in the scale-up rooms, that was really cool because it was a smaller class size. But at the same time, it was just like, I'm being put in this small group of people who are all white, and once again, I have to prove myself to them.
Thanks. So this example, in this quote, we see that Robert felt pressured to represent himself well in a group of white students in that smaller class size room in this course. The last theme I'd like to discuss with you guys is the theme of using strengths to persist. This theme was about Black science majors' community cultural wealth supported their persistence despite the enormous stress. So this theme is about believing that failure is not an option, and also the reliance of spiritual capital, the novel form of capital that Julie discussed earlier. There was also the idea of using aspirational capital to push through. So we can see a quote of that from Susan.
I walked into my general chemistry class. The professor immediately said, 50% of you will change your major after taking this. But I was like, I'm not leaving. I already have my goals, my dreams, ambitions. I had already pictured myself in my white coat. My brain was 10 steps ahead of the professor's. My dreams meant more to me than being scared off by a single progress check.
Thank you. So we see here in this example from Susan that she had already pictured herself being successful. She had already pictured herself in her white coat. So she wasn't scared off or deterred by a single assignment, such as that progress check in her general chemistry class. So for conclusions, we talked about Black science majors at a PWI use all forms of capital. They also use novel forms of capital, as we saw earlier. Black science students also use unique strengths to persist in their respective science majors. And that, so the natural question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? So I'd like to pause here and emphasize that we discussed giving specific recommendations about promoting the success of Black science students, but we hesitate to do so because there's no silver bullet. So instead, I want to give you guys some starting points to discuss. So the first starting point I'd like to make is that being intentional in your efforts to promote the success of Black science majors. This encompasses ensuring a welcoming environment, especially in the classroom, but also it reaches far beyond that of identifying your own biases and refusing to feed into them. The second point I'd like to make is that we need to be aware of the domino effect that occurs when you help even just one Black science major. So supporting the success of one Black science major creates a domino effect far beyond that one student. So essentially, your efforts will be multiplied by the networks and peers and community cultural wealth that the student has. The last point I'd like to make is be a part of a group effort to promote Black students' persistence in their majors. The responsibility should not be based solely on organizations and Black students that were designed to support marginalized groups. Rather, the responsibility should be shared among faculty and administrators alike. It's also important to help recognize Black science achievement. And so the last point I'd like to make with this is it's not enough to recruit Black science majors to college, but we also need to promote their success while they're in college. So that's that. We'd like to thank additional members of our research team, the UGA Berg Group and LSAMP, and we'd also like to thank our funding sources. Thank you, and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Can you talk a little bit about students discussed about mentoring, and would you consider that falling under the familial capital? Because we're always, not pressured, but we're always told we need to have a big network of supporters, and not only against students, but against professionals, and can students talk about that forming capital and where they found that?
Yeah, sure. Can you remember to repeat the question?
So the question was about mentoring and what form of capital it belongs to. So it could belong into familial capital and perhaps other forms of capital that we saw. So the answer to that is yes, certainly we did see in our participants that they discussed mentoring, especially from older, senior, more senior Black science majors. So that's certainly familial because we saw our participants considered friends and family alike in familial capital, but it could also be navigational capital as well because they're utilizing resources to persist. They're utilizing resources to gain ahead. So certainly we did see that. Yes.
So this was a really nice study, thank y'all. I really like the idea of flipping the script, right? So looking at the positive instead of the negative. A lot of your quotes seem to come from female, so I'm wondering what the gender breakdown was, and if you saw any differences in the female students who have that duality of both the minority female in science, but also the minority in terms of race as well.
So we did have more female participants. Oh, so the question was regarding that many of the quotes today are from female participants. What was the distribution of our study participants, and did we see issues arise for our students who were both women and also Black women? And I would say yes, your perception is correct that we did recruit more women to our study than we did men, and that does reflect the number of Black women we have in science versus Black men we have in science at this particular institution. And your question regarding intersectionality about being both Black and being a woman did come up in some of the interviews, but in fact, a lot of what we saw is that the Black men in our study had a different experience in terms of more pressure because there were fewer of them in the classroom. The notion of that pressure to maintain a certain image was particularly brought up from our male participants, even more so than our female participants. They felt even more isolated because they were often the only Black male student in the room and maybe one of two students of color who were male, identified as male in the room.
I have a practical classroom question. I use a lot of teamwork where students will work together as a team for a large portion of the semester. And I've really been torn about whether to deliberately put students together, black students together, because they can identify and feel less pressure because they identify with each other in that group. Or if it's better to distribute them among the teams so that there's more diversity within each team.
I'm going to relay that question to a faculty member.
You know, I'm so surprised by this because Brooke and I have had multiple conversations about this. So if I have your permission, I'll kind of share your insight. One of the big things that we talked about in our team, and Brooke shared an experience, is that with group work, there are these issues occurring where sometimes a student is in a group that the rest of the students are white, and maybe they're discounting what they're saying. This kind of goes to that idea that was brought up earlier in our first exercise. And one of the things that Brooke mentioned is that it's helpful if the groups are assigned. So one of the most challenging situations for students that we've talked to is when you just get to pick your own group. And when that happens at a predominantly white institution, the white students tend to find a group quickly, and maybe other students who are marginalized are left to try to put it together. So that would be from our discussions with students. One recommendation is maybe the 2 versus 1 is not is still an issue to be addressed, but definitely don't allow just selecting their own group, so someone could wind up being left out.
So I had a question about your sample again. So all of these are undergrads, and they covered the whole spectrum from freshmen to seniors, or just?
So all the students, so the question is about our sample, and all the students in our study were seniors, and so we were interviewing them in their final year of their senior year in a science major.
So I'm just wondering if you think it may be interesting to look at them longitudinally to see kind of how their attitudes change?
Yes, absolutely. So because we're taking an anti-deficit achievement approach, we wanted to look and say, let's study the stories of people who've been successful. They've persisted, they're going on to graduate and professional school. But your point is well taken that understanding that experience throughout would be valuable as well. So that can be a next step for our research group. And I would just add that one of the things we're focusing on this year is collecting data at a very different type of institution. So we'll be collecting data at a school that we can come to you too, but we can come to your institution. But we have partners at a school that was a 2-year community college until just about 5 or 6 years ago. They started offering 4-year degrees. Students of color predominate at that institution. It's a commuter institution. It's all of its components are very, very different than this study, and we're really excited to learn about how students in that setting might use different forms of capital or to a different degree, and I think we're going to learn a lot no matter what.
And I have one more question about your sample. So were the students primarily U.S. born, or first generation, second generation, or?
Right, so LaTanya's question is about whether or not, I'm repeating for the microphone, so the students are US born or first generation in terms of being in the US. And I really appreciate this question because this is something in our data that our research team is exploring. So we did have students who are first generation in terms of, for example, their parents immigrated here from Nigeria. And we do have a sense that that experience for those students may be slightly different than other students. In fact, one of our research participants said at the end of an interview, I want you to look at this, and we took that note. So that is something we're exploring within our data set because we have at least a third of our participants, they're the first generation in terms of their parents immigrated, say, from Ghana or another country. Yes.
Because there's a difference in being at least in terms of your familial mindset, whether or not you're a minority or not, there's a distinct difference in how you cope.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that we knew going into this study, and we appreciate even more as a research team that has students that come from both family situations, either their parents immigrated here or their family has been here for generations, is that we knew going into the study those the stories of the individuals are not going to be the same. We won't be able to lump them together into one sort of story. And so we do really value that chance to look at that more carefully.
Two last questions, maybe?
So did you look at any students who are of mixed race? Because I know sometimes they have a very distinctive feeling on certain things, and I was just curious if you had any of those in the study.
So the question is about our sample and if we looked at different ethnicities such as mixed race. In our study, we looked at all of them were Black science majors. So they identified as either Black, African American, or Afro-Caribbean. So those are all our studies. So we did not look at different ethnicities, but it's just like Julie mentioned earlier. There was even one of our participants mentioned that it might be a great insight to look at that because their experiences also might be unique. So because they come from two different backgrounds as well.
And I think, Brooke, you actually interviewed a participant who identified as both Black and Latino.
That's right.
Yeah.
I did.
So her question is, was that experience different for the participant?
Oh, okay. We did not separate his experience from two different cultural backgrounds versus the other, who just identified as just one category. If I'm talking about the mixed race versus just single, but we noticed that it is like each experience of those Black students is unique. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like the experiences of those Black students were unique from the, let's say, predominant culture, but then each of those Black students, right, each of their experiences together is also unique. So that, of course, the participants who identified as mixed race was also unique as well. One last question.
Yeah, so this was all done here at UGA, right, the students? Okay, so this is a really huge school, and your participant pool was 20 students. And so it begs the question, I think the criterion that you all use to identify participants, I think, and rightfully so, select students who are willing to use the capital that they have. I think we can all agree that all students have these capitals. The question is whether or not they're willing to use them, right? And so when I'm thinking about when I'm teaching a class, and it's oftentimes the students who are already succeeding in my class are the ones that come see me in office hours. It's the students that struggle that don't come, or if I offer out of class activities, they're the ones least likely because they're not using their capital, I think. And so the question I have is, how many students did you have to screen through to get to those 20? In other words, is there some way you can determine who's using capital and who isn't, or what proportion is and isn't?
Yeah, so the question is about where our study took place and how many participants did we have to, potential participants did we have to go through to get to those that match our criteria. And I know there were some follow-ups, but I'll answer that part first, if that's okay. And so at UGA, the last time we looked when we wrote the grant proposal, Black students in science actually persist at a rate that's higher than any other racial or ethnic group at UGA. So this is a great place to study success. And so we're really glad that we have the opportunity and access to these students. What we left out for time is that we identified students through a nomination process. So faculty and presidents of organizations that serve students of color nominated many individuals. And the question really for us as a team was, could we recruit them to be a part of the study? And so we didn't have problems recruiting 20 students. In fact, we again sampled this year as a part of a broader project. But whether or not those students were willing to meet with us was a different question. And one thing that I think was a strength in our study is that the co-researchers really lead so many parts of it. And they, in fact, are the ones who told Darius and I, no, faculty are not who you need to go to if you want nominations. You need to go to the presidents of all these organizations. And they gave us a list, and they knew those presidents. And those presidents knew which of their members were going to meet these criteria. And science faculty maybe gave us 1 or 2 nominations. We would get 10, 15, 20 from the presidents. Sometimes they were the same students being nominated multiple times. So I did want to respond to that aspect of it. And I think you're right, and I love the point you made that the students already have these forms of capital. it's not something we're going to provide for them. They have it. Because imagining that we're going to provide it for them is a deficit thinking, which you did not have in your question. They already have it, but what Brooke said earlier is true, is they don't necessarily see it as a strength. They assume everyone does it. So we'll be in a research meeting and they'll say, yeah, everyone does that. I'll say, no, not everyone does that. I would have trouble doing that, but you can do it, and you can do it, and you can do it. And so part of what we're trying to do as a research group in our next step, where we create workshops for faculty and for students, is just raising that awareness so that people start to see things a little differently, not just you know, as they interact with Black students, but for Black students themselves to start to see, oh, I do these things, other people don't know how to do them. They have real value in science. And so I hope that addresses your question a little bit, but I'd love to talk with anyone, and I know Brooke would too later, that if you have additional questions.